In 1836, a 32-year-old blacksmith ran for his life, not from a criminal, not from the law, from something worse, his own debts. He left behind a pregnant wife, 3 children, and a burning shop in Vermont, and he ran west with nothing but a hammer, a forge bellows, and $73 in his pocket. 3 years later, that same broke, desperate man invented something so revolutionary it would rip open the American frontier, make him a millionaire, and build an empire that nearly 200 years later would be worth over $60 billion. His name was John Deere. And the story of how he got there, it's darker, stranger, and way more insane than anything they'll ever teach you in a history book. Because what John Deere actually built wasn't a plow, it was a weapon. Stay with me. Let's rewind. Picture Vermont, 1825. A skinny teenager walks into a blacksmith's shop to beg for an apprenticeship. He's got no father. His dad vanished across the Atlantic when John was just 4 years old, chasing an inheritance in England. He never came back. Rumors swirled for decades. Some said he drowned. Others said he started a new family and forgot the old one. John Deere grew up poor, like dirt floor. One pair of shoes, work or starve, poor. But here's where it gets interesting. The kid had hands, freakishly skilled hands. By 21, he was the most talented blacksmith in his county. Farmers lined up for his polished hay forks. Housewives begged for his shovels. Everyone said the same thing. This Deere kid is going places. And he was. Straight into financial ruin. See, John Deere was a genius at making things and a disaster at running a business. His shop burned down twice. He took loans he couldn't repay. Creditors started circling. By 1836, they were about to throw him in debtor's prison. So he did what thousands of desperate Americans were doing that year. He ran west. But here's what nobody tells you about that journey. Because when John Deere arrived at his destination, he walked into the middle of a catastrophe nobody could solve. A crisis so brutal, it was literally breaking American farmers in half, and he had no idea he was about to solve it. Grand Detour, Illinois. 1836. John Deere steps off a wagon into a town of maybe 100 people. Log cabins, mud streets, and all around him, farmland stretching to the horizon. Rich, black, impossibly fertile prairie soil. It should have been paradise. It wasn't, because that black Illinois soil had a dark secret. It was sticky, thick, greasy like tar, and it completely destroyed the cast iron plows that farmers had used for 3,000 years. Think about that. 3,000 years. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to colonial America, the same basic plow design worked everywhere. But here, on the American prairie, it failed catastrophically. Farmers would push their plows into the ground, and the soil would stick to the blade like wet concrete. Every 3 feet, they'd have to stop, scrape the plow clean with a wooden paddle, start again, stop, scrape, start again. Plowing a single acre took an entire day, sometimes 2. Men were breaking their backs. Wives were burying their husbands young. Families were abandoning their farms and moving back east in defeat. Some farmers, and this is documented, took their own lives rather than face another spring of that impossible soil. The American Midwest, the future breadbasket of the world, was on the verge of being abandoned, and into this apocalypse walked a broke blacksmith with a hammer and an idea. But here's what you need to understand. The idea that made John Deere famous. It didn't come from a lab. It didn't come from engineering school. It came from a broken saw blade in a sawmill. And what he did with it, nobody saw coming. 1837. John Deere walks into a sawmill in Grand Detour. He's not looking for inspiration. He's looking for scrap metal, because he's still broke and metal is expensive. And in the corner, he sees it. A broken steel saw blade, polished smooth from years of cutting, shiny, slick, almost mirror-like. And in that moment, in his head, something clicks. What if the reason those plows kept jamming wasn't the shape? What if it was the material? Cast iron is rough, pitted, porous, Of course, the sticky soil clung to it, but polished steel was slippery. He grabs the blade, runs back to his forge, and for the next several days, barely sleeping, he hammers that saw blade into a curve, a beautiful, graceful, self-cleaning curve, a shape that would let the soil slide right off the blade as the plow moved forward. He called it the plow that broke the plains. And here's where the story gets wild. He takes his prototype to a farmer named Lewis Crandall, pushes it into the soil, and the plow just glides. The dirt peels off the blade like butter off a hot knife. An acre that used to take 2 days, done in a few hours. Crandall looks at John Deere and says something like, "Make me another one." Then the neighbor sees it. Then the neighbor's neighbor. Within a year, John Deere was selling plows faster than he could forge them. But here's the part that's gonna blow your mind. Because at this exact moment, John Deere made a decision that basically every business guru today tells you is insane, and it made him a fortune. Back in 1837, if you were a blacksmith, you did things one way. A farmer walked into your shop, told you what they needed. You made it. They paid. Done. That was the model. For literally thousands of years, John Deere looked at that model and said, "No, we're doing this backwards." He started making plows before anyone ordered them, stockpiling them, building inventory. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. "Who's gonna buy a plow that's already made?" they laughed. "What if the dimensions are wrong? What if the farmer wants something different?" But John Deere knew something they didn't. He knew farmers were desperate. He knew time was money. He knew a farmer who could walk in, grab a plow, and start planting that same afternoon would pay a premium for it. He was right. Spectacularly right. By 1841, just 4 years after that sawmill moment, he was making 75 to 100 plows a year. By 1846, over 1,000. By 1849, but here's the twist. The bigger he got, the more he realized Grand Detour had a fatal flaw. It was landlocked. No river, no railroad. Every pound of steel he imported, every plow he shipped out, had to travel by slow, expensive wagon over muddy roads. So in 1848, he did something his business partner begged him not to do. He burned the bridge, moved the entire company 75 miles south to a town on the Mississippi River called Moline, Illinois. His partner quit in protest, said he was throwing away everything they'd built. But John Deere had seen the future, and the future ran on water, then rails. Within a decade, John Deere and Company was shipping plows to every state in the Union. Within 2 decades, they were an industrial titan, and then the country went to war with itself. April 12, 1961, Fort Sumter. The Civil War begins, and while most people think of the Civil War as a story of soldiers and generals, there's a hidden story. A story nobody teaches you. The Civil War was the first modern war in human history. And modern wars aren't won by armies. They're won by supply chains. Here's the brutal math. The Union Army needed to feed 2 million soldiers. Those soldiers used to be farmers, which meant the men still at home. The old, the young, the wounded, the women had to somehow produce more food than before with half the labor. It should have been impossible. Except John Deere had spent the last 20 years building the one tool that made it possible. His self-scouring steel plow didn't just make farming easier, it let one man do the work of 3. One woman with a Deere plow and a mule could now feed a regiment. And so, while the South starved, literally starved, with bread riots in Richmond by 1863, the North had so much surplus grain they were exporting it to Europe during the war. That surplus fed the Union Army. It funded Lincoln's government. It paid for the ironclads and the cannons and the trains. John Deere's plow didn't just build a business. Historians have argued, and this is a real argument, that it helped win the Civil War. By 1868, John Deere and Company was incorporated. John Deere himself, that broke blacksmith who'd fled Vermont 32 years earlier with $73 in his pocket, was now one of the wealthiest manufacturers in America. But wealth wasn't the end of the story. Because now, this man, this self-taught farmer's son, was about to face a threat that could destroy everything he'd built. And it wasn't the competition. It was his own son. John Deere had a son named Charles. Charles was brilliant, ruthless, ambitious, trained since childhood to inherit the empire. And Charles Deere looked at his father's company and saw a dinosaur. By the 1870s, America was changing fast. Plows weren't enough anymore. Farmers wanted cultivators, harrows, corn planters, seed drills, and soon the biggest machine of them all, tractors. John Sr. was in his 70s, set in his ways. He wanted to keep making the perfect plow. Charles wanted to build an empire. Father and son clashed hard. There are letters from this era preserved in the Deere archives where their fights jump off the page. At one point, Charles threatened to quit and start his own rival company. But John Deere, for all his stubbornness, had one great gift. He knew when to step aside. In 1886, John Deere died at age 82, and Charles took over. What Charles did next rewrote American business forever. He didn't just expand the product line. He bought out competitors, acquired patents, merged with rival companies. By 1911, Deere Company wasn't just a plow maker. It was a full-line agricultural equipment juggernaut. And in 1918, Charles's successors made the move that would define the next century. They bought a tiny, struggling tractor company called Waterloo Boy. At the time, it seemed like a risky bet. Tractors were new, expensive, unproven. But those Waterloo Boy tractors would eventually evolve into the iconic green and yellow John Deere tractors you see today. The machines that would mechanize the entire planet's agriculture, feed billions of people, and push Deere Company's market value past $60 billion. But here's what almost no one knows. There's a reason those tractors are green and yellow, and the reason is kind of beautiful. Walk onto any farm in America, any farm, anywhere, in any state, you'll see it. Green body, yellow wheels, the leaping deer logo. It's so iconic that John Deere green is actually a trademarked color. But why green and yellow? There are a few theories, and the most widely shared story among collectors and old-time Deere employees goes like this. John Deere himself loved the countryside, the green of the fields, the yellow of the ripening corn. And when his company started painting equipment in the late 1800s, they chose those colors as a tribute to the American farmer, the customer who had made them everything they were. Whether that exact story is gospel truth or folklore polished by time, the symbolism stuck, because every John Deere machine rolling off the line today still wears those colors. Every single one. And here's the part that's truly wild. That logo, the leaping deer, has been redesigned only a handful of times in nearly 150 years. The deer you see on a brand new $800,000 combine harvester in 2026 is the direct descendant of a logo designed in Think about that. Coca-Cola has changed its logo. Apple has changed its logo multiple times. Ford, GM, IBM, all completely transformed. John Deere, same leaping deer, same green, same yellow, for almost a century and a half. Because John Deere isn't just a company, it's a promise, a handshake across generations. A grandfather tells his grandson, "Son, if you buy green, it'll still be running when your grandkids are farming this land." And here's the crazy thing, they're not wrong. There are John Deere tractors from the 1940s still working American farms today, 80 years old, still plowing. Try that with your iPhone. So let's recap the insanity. A broke blacksmith runs from his debts in 1836, lands in Illinois, sees a broken saw blade in a sawmill, turns it into a plow that breaks the prairie, survives financial ruin, builds an empire on the banks of the Mississippi, helps the Union win the Civil War by feeding it, hands the business to his ambitious son, who turns it into the global agricultural giant that would, 19 years later, be worth more than the GDP of many countries. And it all started because one man, with nothing but a hammer and $73, refused to quit. That's the real story of John Deere. Not a plow, not a tractor, not a logo. A man who looked at impossible odds, stared into a soil that had beaten every farmer for thousands of years, and said, and he did. The next time you drive past a field and see that flash of green and yellow on the horizon, that tractor rolling across the American heartland, remember, you're not looking at a machine. You're looking at the legacy of a scared, broke 32-year-old who ran west with nothing and built a dynasty that's still standing nearly 200 years later. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me one small favor. Stick around, because the stories behind the brands you see every single day, they're wilder than any movie Hollywood has ever made. And I've got a lot more coming. See you in the next one.